The man in the tailored suit cleared his throat, trying to hide a smirk. "Excuse me, sir. This meeting is for investors only." He thought he was being polite. He wasn't, because the man he was dismissing wasn't just any outsider. He was the one who had quietly become the largest shareholder in the entire company. The same company that once chewed him up, spit him out, and left him humiliated in front of everyone. That man's name? Daniel Hayes. Now, if you looked at him standing there in his wrinkled shirt, with shoes that had clearly seen better days, you wouldn't immediately guess the truth. You wouldn't see the battles carved into his face, the long nights that aged him before his time, or the bitterness he had learned to swallow whole. But here's the twist. Daniel wasn't there to beg. He wasn't there to watch from the sidelines. He was there to take back the table that once told him he'd never belong. And, oh, the irony, the same boardroom that had laughed when he was fired now had his name etched into the records as their majority owner. How does a man go from broke, forgotten, and nearly homeless to standing in the same room with billionaires, holding the kind of power that no one could ignore? It wasn't magic, wasn't luck, it was pain, grit, and the kind of determination that only comes when life leaves you with absolutely nothing to lose. But to really understand this moment, to understand why Daniel didn't even flinch when they tried to push him out of that meeting, we have to rewind back to where it all started, to the days when Daniel Hayes was nobody's hero, not even his own. So buckle in, story lovers, 'cause this one's going to sting before it inspires. And hey, welcome, story lovers. From where are you watching? Drop your city name in the comments so we can see how far our story travels. Asterisk, Daniel Hayes wasn't born with a silver spoon. If anything, his was made of tin bent, dented, and borrowed from the neighbors when dinner was scarce. He grew up in a small Midwest town, the kind of place where everyone knew when your lights got cut off and where pity spread faster than gossip. His father worked at a factory until the plant closed, and his mother stretched pennies into meals that looked like feasts to a child who didn't know better. Daniel knew early what hunger felt like, not just in the stomach, but in the soul. But here's the thing about kids who grow up with nothing. They either accept it or they fight it. Daniel chose to fight. School was his battleground. He wasn't the loudest, not the most charming, but he was sharp. Numbers came to him like second nature. Equations that made others sweat were puzzles he could solve in seconds. Teachers called him gifted. His classmates called him weird. Either way, he kept pushing. He dreamed of becoming a financial analyst, maybe even running his own firm one day. Not to be rich, though he wouldn't have minded that, but to prove that someone like him could sit at the big table. He pictured himself in crisp suits, talking stocks and strategy, while the world finally saw him as more than that kid from the poor family. Life, however, has a cruel sense of timing. Daniel's first taste of real opportunity came with a scholarship. To a state university, he was on fire, top of his class. Professors already whispering about internships at Fortune 500 companies. For once, the world seemed to tilt in his favor. He thought he had escaped the cycle. Then came the phone call. His father's heart gave out one winter morning. No savings, no insurance, no backup plan. Just bills and a mother too broken to keep going on her own. So Daniel did what survivors do. He pressed pause on his dreams. He dropped out of school to take care of his family. Nights that should have been spent studying for exams were instead spent hauling boxes at a warehouse, flipping burgers at a fast food joint, and doing whatever it took to keep the lights on. His textbooks gathered dust. His classmates moved on. But the real breaking point came years later when Daniel finally clawed his way back into the corporate world. He had worked his way into a junior position at an investment firm, burning through nights and weekends just to keep up. He was hungry, ambitious, and for a brief moment, it felt like the sacrifice had been worth it. Until the betrayal, it happened. Fast. A deal went wrong, one that Daniel had warned his bosses against. He had seen the numbers, done the math, raised the red flags. But he was young, too unseasoned, and nobody wanted to listen. When it all collapsed, millions were lost. And millions were lost. And someone had to take the fall. Guess who they chose? Daniel. In one meeting with a smirk from the same executives he had been trying to impress, they stripped him of his title, cut him loose, and left him branded as careless and incompetent. Years of clawing, years of sacrifice, gone in a single afternoon. The humiliation followed him like a shadow. His mother, proud of him for finally making it, couldn't understand why he was suddenly unemployed again. He couldn't tell her the truth that the system wasn't designed to protect people like him. Instead, he told her it was just a temporary setback. But temporary stretched into months. The money ran thin. His apartment shrank. He sold furniture piece by piece, pawning off anything that wasn't nailed down just to keep food on the table, and still. He didn't give up. Daniel read financial reports in libraries when he couldn't afford internet. He scribbled ideas in notebooks by candlelight when the power was cut. He studied markets with the obsession of a man chasing oxygen. It was survival, yes, but it was also preparation, because while the world saw a man falling apart, Daniel was quietly sharpening himself into something the boardrooms of tomorrow wouldn't see coming. Sometimes life doesn't hand you second chances. It disguises them as accidents. For Daniel Hayes, the shift began in the unlikeliest of places. A cramped public library with flickering lights and chairs that wobbled if you breathed too hard. He was broke, nearly invisible, and hanging on by sheer willpower. But in those aisles of dusty finance, books, and discarded newspapers, Daniel found something that would change everything. He noticed patterns, not just in numbers, but in behavior. Companies that bragged about innovation on the front page of the Wall Street Journal were quietly hiding layoffs in the back. Banks that promised stability were quietly shifting assets in ways that made his stomach knot. Daniel's mind, wired for numbers, started to connect dots that others missed. At first, it was just scribbles in his notebook. But then one day, he overheard a conversation at the library between two men in suits. They were discussing a startup, just another tech company, from the sound of it. But when they dropped the name, Daniel's ears perked up. He had read everything about that company, and he knew something the men didn't. Their financial statements didn't add up. They were overvaluing assets and underreporting liabilities. It was fraud, plain and simple. Daniel could have walked away, but he didn't. He went home, lit a candle because his electricity was out again, and pored over every report he could get his hands on. He built a case, not for anyone else, but for himself, to prove he wasn't crazy. To prove that the instincts that had once made him valuable at the firm hadn't been broken by failure. And here's where fate intervened. One night, Sari sat in that same library. A man noticed his work. His name was Richard Lowe, an older investor with a sharp suit that looked out of place in the dusty aisles. Richard leaned over Daniel's notes, squinted, and chuckled. "You've got a good eye," he said, tapping one of Daniel's scribbles. "Most people don't see this kind of thing. You ever thought of putting your talent to use?" Daniel almost laughed. Talent? He was living off instant noodles and selling his furniture to survive. But Richard wasn't joking. Over the weeks that followed, the man took an interest in him, bought him coffee, asked about his story, listened not with pity, but with curiosity. Richard wasn't a saint. Let's be clear. He saw potential in Daniel because potential meant profit. But sometimes mentorship doesn't come wrapped in kindness. It comes wrapped in sharp edges and high expectations. Richard gave Daniel his first real break, a small pool of money to test his instincts in the market. "Prove yourself," he said. "Turn this into something. If you're wrong, it's pocket change to me. If you're right, we'll talk. No pressure, right?" Daniel worked like a man possessed. Nights blurred into mornings. His apartment floor was littered with crumpled paper, financial statements, and takeout boxes. He wasn't just investing, he was dissecting. Watching companies like a hawk, reading their moves the way a chess master anticipates an opponent. And he was right. Over and over again. The small pool of money grew. Richard was impressed. But success always comes with shadows. For every door that opened, another slammed. Some of Richard's associates weren't happy about the kid. They saw Daniel as a threat, a charity case being dragged into rooms he didn't belong in. Jealousy festered. Rivals whispered. Deals that looked solid would suddenly collapse at the last second. Sabotage, Daniel suspected. Though he could never prove it. One man in particular, a slick operator named Carlton Reeves, made it his mission to put Daniel in his place. Carlton was everything Daniel wasn't. Polished, connected, born into the right circles. He had Ivy League charm and a Rolodex of contacts who owed him favors. And Carlton hated that Richard was suddenly paying more attention to the nobody with cheap shoes. It all came to a head when Richard invited Daniel to a private dinner with a group of investors. It was supposed to be a chance to prove himself, to show his ideas had weight. But Carlton had other plans. During the dinner, Carlton casually leaked confidential reports to discredit Daniel's analysis, making him look reckless and uninformed. Laughter spread around the table. The same laughter Daniel remembered from the day he was fired years ago. It was humiliation. All over again. Daniel walked out of that dinner sick to his stomach. He could have quit then. He could have told himself the world was right, that he would always be the outsider. The man clawing at doors that would never open. But here's the thing about people who've already lost everything. Humiliation doesn't break them. It fuels them. Daniel doubled down. He stayed quiet, played the game, and kept watching. And soon he noticed something Carlton didn't. One of the companies Carlton himself had vouched for, a glamorous headline-making darling of the stock market, was rotten at its core. Daniel had the data to prove it. And if he was right, the fallout wouldn't just take down the company. It would take Carlton with it. The stakes had never been higher. Expose the truth. And Daniel risked being blacklisted forever if he was wrong. Stay silent and Carlton would keep rising, crushing him every step of the way. For Daniel, the choice wasn't really a choice at all. He'd been quiet before and it cost him everything. Not this time. With trembling hands and a fire in his gut, Daniel began to craft a plan that would either destroy him or finally force the world to see him for what he really was. The conference room smelled of polished wood and old money, the kind that never had to worry about late fees or pawn shops. Daniel Hayes walked in wearing his best suit, which still looked 2 paychecks shy of everyone else's cheapest option. He felt the eyes on him instantly, some curious, some amused, some outright hostile. At the head of the table sat Carlton Reeves, smirking like a man who already knew the ending of the story. "Gentlemen," Carlton began smoothly, "before we dive into the quarterly strategies, I just want to address something minor. Seems Mr. Hayes here has concerns about one of our prized companies. Concerns that, frankly, are unfounded and potentially damaging." Laughter rippled around the table. The same suffocating, arrogant laughter Daniel had heard before when he was blamed, fired, discarded like garbage. But this time, he didn't flinch. He had brought evidence. "Excuse me," Daniel said, his voice calm but steady. "If you'll give me a few minutes, I think the numbers will speak for themselves." Carlton waved a dismissive hand. "Numbers? This is business, Hayes, not math class." But Daniel pressed forward. He opened a thin folder, laid it flat on the glossy table, and slid copies across. His heart hammered, but his voice sharpened as he spoke. Page 3. Liabilities listed at half of their actual value. Page 5. Assets double counted across subsidiaries. And here, he pointed at the last sheet. Revenue fabricated. Not once, not twice, but quarter after quarter. The room went still. Pens froze mid-scribble. Eyes darted between the pages. "This isn't speculation," Daniel continued, voice gaining force. "It's fraud. Billions in fabricated market value. And if this board ignores it, the collapse will destroy not only the company, but every one of you tied to it. Carlton laughed, but it sounded thinner this time. Do you expect us to believe you over professionals who've been doing this for decades? Daniel leaned in. I don't expect you to believe me. Expect you to believe the math. And if you don't, well, the SEC will. So will the Department of Justice and the press. A ripple of unease swept the room. One man cleared his throat, nervously. Another whispered something to his neighbor. Carlton's mask began to crack. His jaw tightened, his polished confidence slipping. This is reckless, he snapped. You're finished, Hayes. You'll never work again. But Daniel didn't back down. He pulled one last page from his folder letter, already stamped, already addressed. I've already sent copies. By the time this meeting ends, regulators will have them in hand. I didn't come here to beg for a seat at your table, Carlton. I came here to flip it. Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Then came the murmurs. Investors flipping through papers, whispering, eyes widening as the weight of the evidence sank in. The balance of power shifted right there in real time. Richard, low, seated quietly at the far end, finally spoke. His voice was steady, cutting through the noise. I think it's clear we've been misled. Daniel's analysis is solid. Carlton, if what's here proves true, and I suspect it will, you've jeopardized all of us. The smirk was gone now. Carlton paled, sweat gathering at his temples. For the first time, he looked small. Daniel, on the other hand, stood taller. Years of humiliation, poverty, and rejection crystallized into this one moment. He wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was rewriting his story in front of the very people who once laughed at him. And then? The final blow. Richard turned toward Daniel. From this moment forward, I motion that we remove Carlton Reeves from this board, pending investigation. And that Daniel Hayes take his place. Gasps filled the room. Carlton sputtered, but the momentum had shifted. Cans raised. One after another. Votes cast. Eyes locked on Daniel, not with pity, but with respect. The same boardroom that once symbolized his downfall had become the stage of his redemption. Daniel gathered his papers, slid them back into his folder, and stood. His voice was steady, almost casual, but the weight of it landed like a hammer. You all thought I was finished. But numbers don't lie, and neither does perseverance. As he walked out, the silence was deafening. Carlton sat slumped, defeated, while the others stared after Daniel as if seeing him for the first time. It wasn't wealth that made Daniel powerful in that moment. It wasn't revenge. It was the undeniable proof that truth, when armed with courage, can silence even the loudest rooms. Dear audience, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to give it a like. It really helps. Daniel didn't stay in that boardroom. He could have. They offered him a permanent seat, a salary that looked more like a phone number, and the kind of perks people dream about. For a kid who once rationed instant noodles, it should have been a dream come true. But Daniel said no. Not out of pride, not out of anger, out of clarity. He hadn't fought his way back just to spend his life in the same toxic circles that once tried to bury him. He didn't want to be another suit around the table. He wanted to build his own, so he walked away. Within months, Daniel took the modest settlement money he had earned from his whistleblowing case, paired it with the small profits he and Richard had built together, and started his own firm. But it wasn't flashy, not some skyscraper with his name in gold letters. His office was one floor above a laundromat, where the hum of dryers blended with the sound of his phone ringing. He called it Hayes Analytics. The mission: simple, expose truth, protect small investors, teach people, ordinary, overlooked people, how to navigate the financial world that had nearly destroyed him. He didn't chase billionaires. He chased fairness. And it worked. At first, his clients were small businesses, retired teacher who invested her pension and didn't want to be swindled, a young couple starting a bakery, People who needed someone who spoke plain English instead of financial jargon, Daniel gave them tools, knowledge, and confidence. Word spread. Hayes Analytics became known as the firm for the people. Eventually, bigger clients came knocking, companies who wanted transparency, not tricks. Fortune 500s who were tired of their own shady practices being exposed by outsiders. Daniel trained them in accountability, not cover-ups. He became the man people listened to not because of power, but because of integrity. And back home, the boy who once left college to save his family was now the man who rebuilt it. His mother, older and slower now, no longer counted pennies. She lived comfortably with her son's hand steadying her through her twilight years. He never bragged about money. He bragged about being able to buy her the medicine she needed without fear, about taking her to dinner without scanning the biddy menu for the cheapest option. Nail never married into wealth, never sought the glamorous lifestyle. He chose peace, a modest house, a small circle of trusted friends, and a life where he could finally breathe without wondering if the floor would collapse beneath him. And the people who once mocked him, the ones who sneered at his shoes, who dismissed him as nothing, they saw his name in headlines, not for scandal, but for impact. Hayes Analytics, changing Wall Street's culture from the ground up. Reporters called him the outsider who outsmarted the system, but Daniel never let it get to his head. Fame wasn't the goal. Redemption was. Sometimes he went back to that same library where it all began. He'd sit quietly in the finance aisle, pretending to read, while watching kids hunched over notebooks. He'd slip a $50 bill into the cover of a struggling student's textbook, never staying long enough for thanks, because he remembered exactly how it felt to chase dreams with empty pockets. The most healing moment came years later. At a small-town university not far from where he grew up, they invited him to give a lecture. He walked into the auditorium packed with students, professors, and even some old teachers who remembered him as the kid with the numbers. Daniel looked out over the crowd and saw himself reflected back, hungry kids from broken homes. Kids who'd been told they didn't belong in the big leagues. He spoke not about stocks or strategies, but about resilience, about how life will sometimes strip you bare before it hands you a breakthrough. The applause that followed wasn't just for him. It was for every invisible fighter who finally felt seen. Daniel Hayes didn't retire a billionaire. He retired something better, a man at peace with himself. He built a life where truth mattered more than titles, where dignity mattered more than wealth. And when he walks into rooms now, people don't look past him. They look to him. He's no longer the nobody they once laughed at. It's undeniable. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories every week. Asterisk, they once thought Ruth's story ended with a mop in her hand and silence on her lips. But life had other plans. Because the truth is, Ruth wasn't just cleaning floors. She was quietly holding the broken pieces of her world together. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every dollar stretched until it tore, was training her for the day she would stand tall and refuse invisibility. Her story reminds us of something most of us forget. Greatness doesn't always come wrapped in titles or corner offices. Sometimes it looks like a woman scrubbing conference tables while secretly running calculations in her head proof. That dignity can survive even when dreams are delayed. And maybe that's the lesson. You don't have to be seen to be strong. And you don't need recognition to be remarkable. But Ruth's ending came with something more, something no one could have predicted. Months after her whistleblowing shook the company to its core, she received a letter. Not from a lawyer, not from the press, from a young woman she had never met. The letter said, "I was one of the interns at the firm. I saw you walk into that boardroom. That day changed me. I switched my major to accounting. I want to fight corruption the way you did. Thank you for showing me what courage looks like." That was Ruth's real award, not the settlement money, not the headlines, but the quiet knowledge that her courage planted seeds in someone else, that she wasn't just cleaning up one company's mess. She was inspiring a generation to keep the world honest. So the next time you walk past someone who seems invisible, cleaner, the cashier, the driver, remember Ruth. Behind tired eyes and worn hands might live a dream. A brilliance, a story waiting for its moment. Because sometimes the person holding the smallest light ends up guiding the entire room. And maybe that's the twist worth remembering. They thought Ruth was disposable, but history will remember her as undeniable. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories and new videos.